My father betrayed me after I saved his company from $3 million in debt, but when he named the new CEO, he chose my brother who never worked. So, I activated my plan, and the company collapsed in 72 hours, leaving them with nothing. I'm 29 years old. I'm the CEO of my own tech company, and I need to tell this story because what happened 3 years ago basically destroyed my family but also freed me in a way I never imagined. The thing is, I spent years building something incredible, only to have it ripped away from me in a matter of minutes. But it turns out I had planned for exactly that scenario. I guess I should start at the beginning, when I was 26 and had just finished my MBA, because that's when everything started to change. I come from a pretty traditional family. I mean, my father founded a manufacturing company when I was a kid, and it was always his pride and joy, you know? I grew up watching him work day and night to keep it afloat, and honestly, I always admired that about him. I have an older brother, Gabriel, who's like 5 years older than me, and he was always the favorite, like the perfect son who could do whatever he wanted and my parents would justify everything. Gabriel studied business, administration too, but honestly, he was never very dedicated. Let's say he was more the charismatic type who got things through his personality rather than hard work. I was different. I was always the one staying up late studying, the one doing things right. But my parents didn't really notice it as much because Gabriel was the firstborn, and you know how that is in some families. When I finished my MBA in 2019, I came back home with plans to look for a job at some big company, maybe consulting or something like that. But one day I went to visit my father at the office and I found him literally with his head in his hands, surrounded by unpaid invoices and account statements showing red numbers everywhere. I sat down with him and he explained the situation. That the company was basically bankrupt. That he had made bad expansion decisions years ago and now creditors were calling constantly. Some suppliers wouldn't even sell them materials anymore and employees hadn't been paid in full. For 2 months. They had debts of something like $3 million, and the income wasn't even enough to cover payroll. My father was 58 years old at that point, and he looked like 70, completely defeated. I asked him where Gabriel was, because technically, he worked at the company as vice president of sales or something like that, and my father just sighed and said Gabriel was on a business trip in Miami. Turns out Gabriel was almost never at the office. He was always on supposed meetings with clients, but basically spent his time traveling and enjoying himself with the company card. I knew my father wasn't going to say anything negative about Gabriel. He never did. So I just told him, let me review the numbers. Let me see what can be done. That night, I took like 10 boxes of documents to my apartment and spent 3 whole days, barely sleeping, reviewing every invoice, every contract, every financial statement. And what I discovered was worse than I thought, but I also saw opportunities. The company had good contracts with some big clients. The problem was that operations were a total disaster. There were unnecessary expenses everywhere, inefficient processes that cost a fortune, and basically nobody was supervising anything. I presented my father with a complete plan. I told him I could save the company, but I needed total control of operations, that he should focus on relationships with old clients, and I would handle the rest. He looked at me with that mix of hope and doubt, but he was so desperate that he agreed. That's when what were literally the most intense years of my life began. I moved back to my parents' city. I left my apartment and basically lived at the office. I worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more. The first thing I did was renegotiate all the debts. I personally called each creditor and presented them with a realistic payment plan. Some accepted, others didn't. But I bought time. Then I fired like 15 people who basically did nothing, or did their jobs poorly, which was horrible because they were families that depended on those incomes. But there was no choice. The company couldn't sustain that dead weight. I restructured all the production processes, implemented new systems, automated what could be automated, and started aggressively looking for new clients. Gabriel was still the vice president of sales, but honestly, didn't do much. He showed up at the office like twice a week, always well-dressed and with stories of important meetings, but I never saw him close any significant deals. My father said nothing. In fact, when I mentioned that Gabriel should be more present, my father defended him, saying Gabriel had his own work style and that client relationships take time. My mother was the same, always finding excuses for Gabriel, like he was busy. He had a lot of stress, that I didn't understand his position. The truth is, it frustrated me a lot, but I was so focused on saving the company that I didn't have time for family. Drama. The first 6 months were brutal. Basically, we were surviving month to month, but little by little things started to improve. I got 3 new contracts with tech companies that needed manufactured components, and these contracts were much more profitable than the old ones. I invested in new machinery, not much because we didn't have capital, but enough to improve quality and production speed. I hired new people, young and hungry for success, and created a completely different work environment, more dynamic, more focused on results. By the first year, we had already paid like 40% of the debts, and we were generating profits again. My father was incredibly relieved and proud, but curiously, he never gave me public credit for it. At family dinners, he talked about how the company was resurging, but he said it as if it were a collective effort, as if Gabriel and I were working side by side, when the reality was that I was carrying all the weight and Gabriel occasionally showed up to take pictures for the company's Instagram. Second year, things exploded in a positive way. We got a contract with a giant automotive company, like one of those that completely changes the game, and suddenly we had to triple our production capacity. I handled the entire expansion, got financing, we opened a second plant, I hired like 80 new people, and I designed the entire operation system to scale fast without losing quality. It was exhausting but also exciting, you know? Seeing something that was dying become something vibrant and successful. The company went from near bankruptcy to generating like $45 million that year. But here's where things get interesting. From the beginning, when I started restructuring everything, I knew there was a risk. I knew my family. I knew Gabriel was the favorite. And I had this persistent feeling that eventually my father was going to find some way to give Gabriel the credit or control, no matter who did the real work. So I did something that, looking back, was the smartest thing I've ever done in my life. When I restructured the company, I created a subsidiary called TechCore Solutions. Officially, it was to handle all the technology and systems part, and I registered it so that I had 100% of the shares of that subsidiary, while the main company, let's say Parent Company Inc., belonged to my father. What nobody knew, except my lawyer and accountant, is that all the really valuable assets were registered under TechCore. The important contracts with the big clients had clauses specifying they were contracting services from TechCore Solutions through Parent Company Inc. All the new machinery we bought was in TechCore's name, and we leased it to the main company. The software systems, the client databases, the proprietary methodologies I developed, everything was under TechCore. Parent Company Inc. basically operated with TechCore assets, paying royalties and leases that looked like normal operating expenses, but that actually gave me real control of the business. I structured it that way because, honestly, I didn't trust that my family would recognize my work. And I was right. Third year was incredible in business terms. We reached $95 million in revenue, expanded to a third plant. We had like 300 employees, and we were considered one of the most innovative manufacturers in our region. I was 29 years old, still working like crazy, but now I had a solid team and things flowed better. My personal life was non-existent. Like I didn't have time for anything else. I'd date a girl occasionally, but nothing serious, because I literally lived for work. Gabriel, on the other hand, had gotten married, had a kid, lived in an amazing house that, oh, surprise, the company had helped him buy, and kept showing up at the office sporadically with his perfect smile and his expensive suits. At some point during that third year, my father started talking about succession plans. He was 61 years old and said he wanted to start retiring, enjoy more time with my mother, travel, that kind of thing. I assumed, naively I guess, that he would name me CEO officially. I mean, I had saved the company, I had transformed it, I had created all the systems, I knew every aspect of the business. But every time I brought up the topic, my father would change the conversation or say he was still thinking about it. Fourth year, we reached $150 million in revenue. We were a well-oiled machine. I had implemented cutting-edge management systems, we had international quality certifications, and clients loved us because we always delivered on time with superior quality. One day in October, I remember it was a Friday because I had planned for the first time in years to take the weekend off. My father called me to his office. He told me he had called an extraordinary shareholders meeting for the following Monday, that he was going to make an important announcement about the company's future. Monday came, and the boardroom was full. There were minority shareholders. Some were uncles and cousins who had invested years ago. There was my mother, Gabriel with his new navy blue suit, and several key employees. My father stood up front with a PowerPoint presentation, talked about the company's history, about how it had been on the brink of collapse and how it had resurged, showed impressive growth charts, and then said that the time had come to pass the torch to the next generation. I was sitting there, in my best suit, feeling a mix of pride and nerves, waiting for him to say my name. And then he said, "It is with great pride that I announce that Gabriel will be our new CEO starting next month. I'm sure that with his vision and leadership, the company will continue to grow and prosper." The room applauded. Gabriel stood up and gave a speech about humility and responsibility. My mother was crying with pride, and I sat there feeling like I'd been hit in the stomach with a baseball bat. After the meeting, I approached my father and asked him privately, why, just why. He told me that Gabriel was older, that he had more leadership experience. What experience? And that it was important to maintain the tradition of the eldest son inheriting the company. I reminded him that I had saved the company, that I had worked day and night for years, that I knew every detail of the operation. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "And I'm very grateful, Alexander. You're going to be an excellent coup under Gabriel's leadership. You'll make a great team." Coup. He was offering me to be the chief operating officer under my brother, who didn't even know how the inventory system worked. The next 2 weeks were surreal. Gabriel started acting like CEO immediately, moved his office to the biggest one, hired an executive assistant, and started making changes without consulting me. Stupid changes. Like he wanted us to implement a new management system just because it was more modern, without understanding that the one we had worked perfectly and was integrated with everything. I tried to explain, but he would cut me off saying he was the CEO now and that he needed to put his stamp on the company. A month after his appointment, Gabriel called a board meeting. I arrived and there were people I didn't know. Turns out Gabriel had brought in outside consultants, an expensive firm of those that charge thousands of dollars to state the obvious. The meeting started, and Gabriel presented a report where he basically said he had discovered irregularities in my management. He said, I had made decisions without board approval, that I had created corporate structures without proper authorization, and that there were expenses I couldn't adequately justify. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked him to be specific, and he started mentioning TechCore Solutions, saying it was a suspicious entity that I had created and that was draining resources from the main company. The consultants presented charts showing all the payments that parent company Inc. had made to TechCore, making it look like I was stealing. I tried to explain the structure, that everything was legal and documented, that TechCore was a legitimate subsidiary that provided real services. But Gabriel interrupted me, saying he had lost the board's confidence. My father was sitting there, silent, not defending me. My mother looked at me with disappointment, as if I had done something terrible. Gabriel continued, saying he had spoken with the company's lawyers and that it was best if I resigned immediately to avoid legal action. I told him I wasn't going to resign, that everything I had done was legal and documented, and that if they wanted to fire me, they would have to do it formally. 5 minutes later, security came in. Gabriel told me I was fired effective immediately for serious misconduct, that I had 30 minutes to clean out my office and leave the building. They escorted me to my office with 2 security guards. I put my personal belongings in a box, and they walked me out of the building that I had saved, from the company that I had rebuilt with my own hands. I went out to the parking lot with my box, sat in my car, and honestly, I didn't feel anything for a moment. I was like numb. Then my whole body started shaking. I don't know if it was rage or sadness or what, but I sat there for like an hour unable to drive. That night, I called my lawyer. I told him everything, and he said, "Are you ready to activate the plan?" And I told him yes. What Gabriel didn't know, what my father didn't know, is that I had prepared for exactly this scenario. Everything was documented, everything was legal, and I had real control of the company without them knowing it. The next day, my lawyer sent a certified letter to the board of directors of Parent Company Inc. The letter explained in detail the real corporate structure. that TechCore Solutions was my property, that all the valuable assets were under TechCore, and that effective immediately, all lease and license agreements were canceled. Basically, Parent Company Inc. no longer had access to the machinery, the software systems, the proprietary methodologies, or the client contracts because those contracts specified TechCore services. I also activated a series of automatic systems I had programmed years ago. These systems sent detailed reports to all shareholders and board members, showing the true contributions of each executive over the last 4 years. They showed that I had generated 98% of the new contracts, that I had designed all the efficient processes, that I had handled all the crises. They also showed that Gabriel had had excessive personal expenses charged to the company. Things like trips to Europe for supposed conferences that never existed, super expensive dinners with clients who weren't registered, and several suspicious transactions. On the third day, my lawyer received frantic calls from the company. Turns out that without access to TechCore's systems, they basically couldn't operate. Production had stopped, they couldn't access product specifications, the management software didn't work, and clients were calling asking what was happening. Gabriel tried to call me like 50 times, but I didn't answer. My father left me a voicemail saying we needed to talk urgently. A week later, federal agents arrived at the Parent Company Inc. offices. Turns out that in my review of Gabriel's expenses to prepare the documentation, I had found clear evidence that he had been diverting company funds to personal accounts, like serious misconduct that qualified as fraud. I had reported this to the corresponding authorities with all the documentation. Employees started resigning massively. In 2 weeks, 93% of the staff had left, and it turns out most of them contacted me asking if they could work for me in whatever I did next. They knew who had really built the company, who cared about them, and who just strutted around like a peacock. Gabriel was formally charged with corporate fraud and embezzlement. They took him out of the office in handcuffs. And I wish I could say I felt satisfaction seeing it. But the truth is, I just felt empty. There were no winners in this. Only losses. Parent Company Inc. collapsed completely in 3 months. Without TechCore's assets, without trained personnel, and with Gabriel's legal scandal, clients canceled their contracts and the company's stock plummeted. My father lost everything. His retirement, his legacy, everything. Meanwhile, I had registered a new company, TechCore Manufacturing, and had transferred all the contracts and personnel. The clients were happy because they kept receiving the same quality service with the same team, just now under my complete direction. The transition was almost transparent for them. 6 months after the disaster, my parents showed up at my new office. They looked destroyed, aged. My father asked me for financial help, said they had had to sell their house that they were living in a small apartment, that savings had run out paying lawyers for Gabriel. My mother cried, saying I was her son and that families should be united. I told them I was going to buy their remaining shares of Parent Company Inc., which were, now worthless, for a symbolic price, enough for them to have some stability, but with conditions. First, that they publicly acknowledge what had happened, that I had built that company and they had betrayed me. Second, that our interactions be strictly transactional from then on, without pretending we were a happy family. And third, that they never, but never, ask me to forgive Gabriel or help him in any way. My father accepted everything without a word. We signed the papers, I gave them a check, and they left. It was the last time I had a real conversation with them. 3 years later, meaning right now, TechCore Manufacturing is one of the most successful manufacturing companies in the region. We have 450 employees, $200 million a year in revenue. And we just launched a completely new product line that's revolutionizing the industry. I work fewer hours than before because I learned to delegate and trust my team. I have a personal life again. I even have a girlfriend I met a year ago and things are going well with her. Gabriel got out of jail 6 months ago after a plea deal with the prosecution. I have no idea what he's doing now, and honestly, I don't care. My father works as a consultant at some small company. We don't talk. My mother sends me text messages on my birthday and at Christmas. I respond with a polite thanks and nothing more. Do I regret how I handled everything? Not really. Could it have been different? Maybe. But I doubt my family would have changed. Some people just can't see the value of what they have until they lose it, and by then it's too late. Last week, I was at an industry conference, and I ran into an old friend of my father's. He told me my father talks about me occasionally, saying he's proud of what I've achieved, but that it's sad the family was destroyed. I answered that the family was destroyed long before I took action, only nobody wanted to admit it. I guess in the end I learned that loyalty to family doesn't mean accepting being treated as less. That sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything first. And that building something with your own hands, something nobody can take away from you because it's grounded in your knowledge and your real work, is worth more than any family approval. Was it perfect revenge? I don't know if I'd call it revenge. It was more like justice, or maybe just survival. What I do know is that I no longer carry that weight of wanting to please people who were never going to value me anyway. And that, honestly, is liberating in a way I didn't expect.